much. We are live with many of our favorite typology stars today. You probably got my announcement earlier. We're going to talk about some judging functions and how we actually evaluate what judging functions people use. And we're going to also dive in a little bit on how to prevent mistyping and things like that. I'm Kiseo Chan. You know me if you're on my channel already. And we'll start with introductions. Asura Psyche, if you want to start us off, tell us who you are and where we can find you, and a little bit about your typology journey.
Sure. My name's Chris. I run the YouTube channel Asura Psyche. I'm a psychology. I like to say I'm a graduate student, even though I'm not in a program, but I'm involved in psychology research and trying to get into graduate programs. Um, I've been studying type for coming up on a decade now, although I didn't really start to get serious until about 5 or 6 years ago. Yeah, that's me. I work with coaching and typing people.
Nice, very nice. Spacey, if you want to go next.
I've just been researching and talking about typology for a time. I have a channel where I have a few videos about it, but I'm usually too lazy to make them. I mostly just do typing sessions with people who consider me to be an expert of some sort. And I don't know, I just enjoy researching, talking about it. And I try to learn as much as I can about what makes people tick and what makes some people different from other people.
Very nice. INTJEquation.
Hi, my name is Jeff. I run a YouTube channel and a podcast, INTJEquation. I'm pretty new at all this and stuff, so just been kind of studying this stuff for a couple of years and trying to find a groove for my channel, I guess.
Very good. Joyce.
Hi, my name's Joyce, and I run a YouTube channel that is my full name, Joyce Meng. And there I interview people of the 16 types, and you kind of get to hear their story of how it's like to be them. I consider it the Humans of New York version of typology, where you get to hear these insider looks into people's lives and how their functions manifest in example form or story form to make it more personal and more 3D rather than a 2D written description. I got into type 11-ish years ago. I'm a certified MBTI practitioner, and I facilitate the instrument in organizations. I also type and coach people.
Beautiful. I guess I'll go next. I'm Kiseo Chan. I've been watching all of your channels for a long time now. I'm honored to have you guys with me today. I stream it on Twitch. Kiseo Chan is the name of the channel. My typology journey kind of started just with a few YouTube videos, and then I got typed by somebody publicly, and with the way that typing session went, I started had suspicions that maybe there's a lot of different views on how to type people, and kind of started my journey that way, trying to see all the different perspectives on type. And yeah, that's kind of where I am today, is investigating and meeting people. We have Lijo.
Hi, my name is Lindsay. My channel is Lijo on YouTube, and I've been researching and into type for past several years now. And the goal behind my channel is just to help people understand themselves better and understand others better. I believe that understanding is the core principle that allows us as humans to connect with each other and communicate effectively, and that there's not really enough of it. So that's what my channel aims to do. And I also do coaching, outside of that, and have, my background's in is in marketing, video content writing, and other things of that nature. But type really is a passion for me because it was one of the first times in my life that I felt actually understood by any entity. And so it's been something that's kind of perpetuated forward so I can help share that with other people.
Beautiful. All right, Matt.
Right. Hey, my name's Matt Sherman. I run the Geek Psychology YouTube channel. Personality type, I mean, I've been studying it for a while, but it was also something that just kind of gave me a broader understanding of who I was and a more in-depth understanding of who I was, and I was able to feel I could accept certain parts of myself and of other people. And so what my channel does is takes it with a geeky gamer perspective, as you would imagine, and personifies the cognitive functions and helps you build rapport with the characters within you is kind of my approach to it. I do coaching and got a couple programs and stuff like that as well.
Wonderful. And we have Michael Pierce.
Yes, hello. I'm Michael Pierce. I have a YouTube channel called Michael Pierce. It's not the one of the guy who sells retro video games, though I'm sure he's a true professional, nor am I the football player from Baltimore, if you couldn't tell. I'm the other Michael Pierce channel. Yeah, sorry. I've been doing this for a while. I guess a lot of people know me, and or have seen my videos, but I guess it's been like 7 years. Has it been that long? Anyway, I wrote a book recently, which I believe there will be a link in the description. I don't know how Twitch works. I feel like an old man. I, um, I'm not sure what else I should say. I feel like the channel speaks for itself if you go there. I've been doing more philosophy videos as of recently, but I have been brewing some ideas for type videos in the future. But anyway, we'll just have to see.
Awesome. All right. So first, I kind of wanted to dive straight into how each of us are looking at the judging functions. So if we could go around and talk about if we're using a specific model, like if we're using OPS or Galenko's book or a specific typing system, and how or if you have kind of created your own system based on definitions you got elsewhere. Basically, how that system or how you are defining each of the judging functions: introverted feeling, extroverted feeling, introverted thinking, and extroverted thinking. And Asura Psyche, if you'd like to start us off with that.
Sure. So I think one of the things I tend to be noted for in the type community is I don't stray too far from young, or at least I try to. Like that's the core philosophy of my channel and how I stick to function. So I really don't use any extravagant other system, but I do attempt to interpret Jung in newer ways. So kind of expand upon maybe what he wrote about. So do you want me to like define how I would define these functions, or is that what you're asking here? Not.
Yes, please. And if you could let me know if they're from a specific model, that helps too.
Sure. So like my definitions aren't going to vary much from looking at psychological types. For me, functions are like information processing units. I think one of the things that is different for me compared to how I see a lot of other people in different type communities approach the judging functions or any of the functions in general is they see them almost more like actions, behaviors, these sorts of things, where for me it's more so about information in and then the values associated with that information, and then what a person does based on that information received is going to differ from person to person. So when it comes to the judging functions, I find that thinking, if I could, I would rename thinking and feeling to, I don't know, maybe like logic and values, something, because I think those are almost better suited to encompass what they actually are. Because I don't find that often the feeling people with feeling preferences are even hyper feeling, or they're super emotional all the time. It's more so that they tend to just have their core values, or they really act on those values more so than the logic behind those values. So yeah, I guess that's kind of a basic definition there. I don't know how far in depth you want me to go.
That sounds good to me. That makes a lot of sense. If we want to have Spacey.
Okay, so again, what are you asking me exactly?
So I'm asking if you have a specific model or a specific system that you use? I know some people use a very specific book that they get their definitions from, or a very specific system, and they'll define the functions according to that book or system specifically.
I don't use a specific system. I guess I just kind of I've looked at all the different systems and I've used them as kind of a launching board to sort of develop, I guess, my own individualized understanding of type. I find bits and pieces of the different systems to be useful and others not so useful. I mostly just kind of arrive at my understanding on, an intuitive basis with a little bit of logical analysis sprinkled in there. I find pretty much every definition that you could find written anywhere to be pretty kind of lacking in its ability to actually describe what is going on with the cognitive functions. If you asked me to give you a definition, I probably couldn't give you a great one. I think a lot, the way this works has to be insanely multifaceted in order to actually attempt to fully encompass what is going on in psychology. So I basically have my own understanding and I kind of intuitively pull in data from people that I interact with and converse with and, try to come to like a holistic understanding of what's going on and try to systematize it in the moment. But I really don't have a system per se that I have devised.
Right. I think a lot of people can probably relate to that, or at least a lot of us in the typology community. INTJEquation, do you have a specific system or model and how you define the judging functions?
Like I said, I'm pretty new to typing. People really outside of my head. I'm really a big component of John Beebe's 8-function model, where it has a cognitive attitudes based on Jungian archetypes. Like introverted feeling looks a lot different than the dominant hero slot than it would like in the inferior or down in the shadow somewhere. So it's pretty sophisticated, I think, and a lot of things are kind of simplified, and I think it's very typology is pretty complex. They're the judging functions, what Jung called the rational functions, are more like decision making and coming to conclusions rather than, taking in information. So it's a wide range of things, I think.
Yeah. And how about you, Joyce Meng? Do you use a specific system, book, or model that you use to define the functions, or have your own definitions that you put together?
I listen to different schools of thought and their different takes on it, and I synthesize my own understanding depending on what I agree with and what I don't agree with there. And so I agree with everyone who spoke. I find I would differentiate these large categories as logic and values, like what Chris said. And I kind of see the introverted judging functions as a vacuum. So they kind of decide in a vacuum of their own self. They're very self-referencing in a certain sense. And that makes them very idiosyncratic. And it's developing it from within and from the ground up. So it's like coming to a conclusion about your values or your logic from the ground up. With the introverted judging, like the TI and FI, whereas I find with FE and TE, they're more externally referencing. So they're organizing what's already there. TE is being efficient and effective by organizing the logic that's already there, and FE is almost looking externally to kind of size up and get a consensus and then understand from there. So I see their origination point as different. As Jung says that the extroverted functions are objective, and he says that the introverted functions are subjective, and that's one of the interpretations I have of that. With subjective, I see it as originating from the self, and objective as in originating from outside of you first. A slight look into it.
That makes a lot of sense. I myself am just now realizing that there is like a lot of different systems and models, and that one definition can be different in one model to another. And so for the longest time, I've just kind of been putting together what seems to be just my impression of what these functions are. And I'm only now starting to actually pick up certain books and read what those definitions are. I'm just now reading Gifts Differing, for example. I have my thoughts on the functions, the judging functions, to put it quickly, is that the introverted functions are the inner world and the extroverted functions are the outer world. And I don't know how accurate my information is because I haven't read the book myself, but I think a lot of my ideas about how the functions work come from BB, but it's secondhand information, so I don't know how accurate it is. Lijo?
Yeah. So I agree with a lot of what everyone has said in terms of I've kind of synthesized my own understanding in a lot of ways of the functions. I've been a big fan of Jung, and I believe that really with most of the different systems that exist out there, they're really all saying the same thing. At the end of the day, everyone has their own different flair of how they will say it or approach it. I think based on who is writing the content and curating the content. But I think at the heart, a lot of them really do reflect on what Jung has written about each function. And, as it relates to the introverted and extroverted functions, I just really see them kind of like what Joyce was saying about where you're referencing internally or externally. When I'm looking at the introverted functions, whether it be FI or TI, that internal reference place. So if you think of ourselves as, these computers, and it's like, okay, well, are you in a first or second position referencing data that is internally stored on your hard drives, or are you going externally referencing the data first and then processing it? So it's like we both do the internal processing and the external processing, but there's going to be some location that you're going to reference data first and more often. And that's going to be that function that will be higher in your stack of functions. And so, the cognitive process, as I see it, is very much a flow and direction. It's not about, I think a lot of people think it's like what you do makes you a certain type. It's not what you do that makes you a certain type. We can all do the same thing, being different types, but it's how you're coming to that action. It's the thought process, it's the cognitive path that is saying, this is why I will do this. This is how I've come to this destination. So yeah, that's how I see it.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense too. Matt?
All right. I don't really know where to start, but I consider these, I think, probably a bit differently than a lot of people, and it's just because of the intention of what I'm trying to do is to get more people into personality type or self-development from this gaming perspective, like through metaphor and things like that. So I consider them as like different characters that you're logging onto, right? Like different ego states or archetypes that you're tapping into, neurological pathways that are being activated at the same time to help you solve a task or something like that. So I just consider them as like, this is a part of me that I'm going to bring out, and maybe this one has its intention around logic and the other one's ideas and values and experiences or whatever it is. So I guess I kind of have a different approach to it, but all of my definitions and stuff have come from of reading and other people's content and stuff like that, and mixing and mashing them together in a way that kind of serves my purpose. And I guess that's it.
How about you, Michael? You have a certain system or book that you use to define the judging functions in particular?
Well, I wrote a book, so I guess I use that.
I need to read it.
No, don't feel bad. But I mean, so obviously there's that. But where obviously the info for the book came from was from Jung, from kind of what everybody else said, a mixture, a mismatch. but mostly from young as much as I can. And just trying to watch people and put it all together. So I mean, the book I wrote probably is the best answer I can give. That's the system I adhere to, if any. So, did you want actual definitions too, or I didn't know if that was superfluous. I didn't want to take up all the time or anything, but.
You can give us quick definitions if you want.
I don't know if there's anything I have to add to what everybody else said, but yeah, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked that. I don't really have anything to add, so we're good. We can move forward.
Okay. My next question is kind of like more of a practical question. So when you're actually in a typing session, or if you type people in your head and you want to type them, what do you need to see in a typing session to decide that, okay, they are using introverted feeling, they're using extroverted feeling? And for lack of a better word, what do you need to observe, hear? What needs to happen for that to be your decision as a typist? If we could start with Asura Psyche.
Yeah. So for me, I think FE and FI in particular tends to be one of the easier ones for me to spot when I'm typing people. And I think you can a lot of times just push on like how they're going to react when they're emotionally stressed or towards certain things that they value, or how they might interact in social situations. And not one of these individually is going to completely give you an answer, but if you see like these huge common trends among these things, it becomes easier. For example, how are you likely to react if you have had a stressful day? Do you want to go talk to a friend about it, or do you want to lock yourself in your room and think about it for a while? Like, that might point towards either extroverted feeling or introverted feeling in terms of how they want to deal with their emotions. Do they want to process it internally and then kind of like explain it to other people, or do they want to like vent it straight in out? Is the feeling coming in and then immediately being sent back out in some sense? You could also ask something along the lines of like, are you ever worried that you might not fit in a social situation? I feel like FE types tend to be more concerned with things like that. I'll often talk with my ENFJ wife, and she says like, "Oh, I have to be everyone's friend wherever I go. Like, I need to make sure that everyone likes me all the time." And for me, I don't feel that at all. It's like I'm just gonna be me and whatever. Like, it is what it is. So, what was the question? I'm sorry, I went on a little ramble there.
So basically, what I'm looking for is, as a typist, when you're sitting down with someone typing them and you're trying to decide what functions are in their
Right.
stack or
Okay,
that they're
yeah.
using, what makes you actually put that tally down for this person's using extroverted feeling?
Yeah, so those are definitely how I would approach the feeling functions. Are we doing thinking as well, or just the feeling for now?
Thinking as well, yeah.
Okay, thinking is the one that can be a little more difficult, but I noticed that TI people in my sessions will ask for context a lot more. Like if I ask them a question, because I'm an NITE type myself, very high, I generalize a lot. So when I ask a question, it's usually not some sort of like specific context or situation that and it can be troublesome for TI to want to answer a question if it's too general. So they'll ask me to be like, hey, like, well, in what situation am I supposed to be feeling this? Or is it going to be like a family member, friend? And more often than not, I find the TI types like stopping throughout the session to want to clarify and make sure that they completely understand something correctly before giving an answer, where the TE types tend to be very willing to generalize, especially if they are an intuitive type who also has TE.
And how I also meant to ask, how do you go about typing someone? Do you have tests? Do you just have interviews? What kind of things do you use?
I do an open form discussion. So I have a set of questions that I use as a rough guideline. Most of the time I veer off from them. And then just kind of follow wherever, like what I need to ask to kind of get the things that I'm looking for in each session. I describe my typing sessions as a discussion, not a diagnosis, and that I'm there to help people find their type, not give them a type. So I encourage people to tell me if they disagree with something that I've said, and we can discuss how my perception might not match the perception that they have of themselves and why we're seeing a disconnect and how we're viewing the things. we are seeing.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Oh, did we just lose Spacey before his turn? Maybe he'll.
There we go. I might need a new webcam soon.
A man overboard.
Anyway, I don't know. I always think that my typing sessions look a lot like a therapy session. I guess you could call it a discussion, but the only consistent question I ask really is what were you like as a young child, because I think that above any other question makes it the easiest to isolate what their dominant functions might be, because I think when you're young and before you develop into a more complete person, it's a lot easier to kind of see functions in isolation. But usually within the first couple of minutes of just talking to them, they'll say something that I can riff off of, and then I'll just start kind of getting them to talk about themselves. And if they say anything particularly interesting, I'll delve into that a little more. And I mean, ultimately, I'm just looking for them to say something that I can connect with, some association that I have with some cognitive function in my mind. And then I can kind of build off of that and kind of come at what their best fit type might be. I mean, that's pretty much how I do it. I really don't have a standardized process at all.
So when you're typing someone, how do you decide like this person's using FI or this person prefers TI in extrovert?
I guess when it comes to the judging functions, I'm just kind of coming to like an intuitive sort of decision based on how they seem to be articulating themselves or how they're reasoning through things in real time. I try to get an idea of how the gears are turning in their head in that given moment, because whatever they say about themselves or whatever they happen to be doing in their life isn't so useful as how they actually, respond to things on like a realistic, immediate basis.
Okay. How about you, INTJEquation? How do you go about typing people? If you use tests, interviews, and how do you decide in a session when you're with the person what judging functions that they might have or prefer?
Like I said, I'm pretty new to typing, so if I do type somebody, it's pro bono, and I'm still trying to figure out my own system and way. As far as like typing something, how I approach it, usually I look for Linda Barron's interaction styles and temperaments. I think that kind of gives a clue, kind of narrow it down to 4 types or so. Like if you have like someone that's kind of like behind the scenes, doesn't really, someone like an INTP, INFP, ISFJ, and so on and so forth. It's like one of those 4 types, and you can figure out their temperament. That kind of narrows it down a little bit. I like to just have conversations with them and kind of see how they answer rather than asking a lot of leading questions, kind of like, well, do you prefer to stay at home during a party or are you the life of the party? Because, they kind of, if they're thinking that they're a certain type, they might answer like a certain type. So I kind of throw those questions here and there a little bit. And yeah, I mean, I just kind of like see how, like, if they talk about how they feel a lot, they discuss their likes and dislikes, that's more indicative of FI. They're more like talking about trying to make me feel good because like they're asking like, why do I look so mad or something like that? Or, it's more like FE. And if they're asking me like what my opinion is or citing sources, say I heard this from this source or heard this from this book or heard this from this person, it's more TE. And TI, they're kind of, that's a little bit trickier for me to detect a little bit. If they kind of have like their ideas and their more concepts and they're asking for more feedback and more clarification, I think that's kind of shows TI a little bit more. And if they're showing like TI, but they're also showing FI, that's kind of a little problematic. So I like to kind of narrow that down because TI is always on access with FE and vice versa and so forth.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Joyce? How do you go about typing sessions and identifying the judging functions in a typing session?
So my process is very similar to personality hackers. I typically conduct my sessions with another person that is certified by Personality Hacker. And the first question I tend to ask is, what do you love to do so much? You could do this indefinitely until you're exhausted because it gives you energy. And it's called the flow state question because you're trying to figure out just the general things that give someone energy and energize them. And so it really depends case by case how the judging functions will show up. Some people will show other signs that another type may not show. Typically with TE, if it's like dominant, it can be easier to spot. Someone who likes to get things done, they are asking what's the next step oftentimes to things, and they're externally referencing, like what INTJEquation said. It's like looking for external logical sources for their data, and resource management, and the need to be efficient and effective, even if it steps on emotional toes. In EJs, it's easier to spot in general. My sessions with EJs are way quicker because they're quite quick with FE and TE are known as expedient decision making, and so sometimes when they articulate their personality, it's a little easier to narrow down EJs. I find that with extroverted judging functions, they think they know what's best for the group. So TE will think it knows what's best for the group in terms of how to get things done in a logical sequence in a way that meets those needs. And FE feels more comfortable speaking for the values of the group. And what Chris said about FE and FI are totally true as well. One of the ways I can kind of point out someone with a dominant introverted judging function, so FI or TI, is that they tend to not be everyone's cup of tea because their understanding of their judging function is so idiosyncratic and may not match the people around them. That's one of the ways I can spot FI or TI, but it really depends on a case-by-case basis. And so I typically type people first with a questionnaire. I'll give them a questionnaire that both has multiple choice and written responses, so it allows someone to tell me their full thought process and share as much as they want to share. And during the verification, I talk someone through either the one option I'm seeing during the session or a few options if it's a more confusing case. And we have a dialogue about it until we're both at a consensus or arrive at a spot that seems correct.
Nice. I forgot I was muted. So Lijo, how do you go about typing people? Do you have a test or I think I've seen you talk about OPS before. I don't know if you use that system or.
I do study through OPS. It's more of a way for me to kind of track my own results with like a kind of like a study group, I guess you could say, just to work on like my own accuracy and my own practice. I don't type people in OPS unless like they are familiar with the language that's used in OPS. It doesn't really make sense to tell someone about basically a fleshed out type that they don't understand the language of. So I'll stick with the functions as just, you know, a general reference point for everyone. But as it relates to the typing process, I type very conversationally. I like to think that I use very kind of non-traditional questioning methods. I try to get people within the first few minutes to start just opening up about like their lives. I'm trying to get them into a place where they're starting to talk with not as much of a guard up, because I think everyone, you know, in the first 10 to 15 to 20 minutes is, you know, in a lot of ways putting on a persona, because that's very default as a human. And then you have, you know, people who are, you have some people who will come to be typed who are trying to get typed as a certain type. You have other people who come to get typed who genuinely want to know who they are. So the thing is once you start asking more non-traditional questions and you start to really drill down to really fear, which is what I believe is one of the core parts of where we can see our inferior or our lower functions, then you start to see the real cognitive path of, you know, what is that person in their own cognition so avoidant of? And then you start to see the pattern of who this person actually is. And I'll always say that sometimes I get a really hard egg to crack. Sometimes you have people who it's really hard to get them to open up. about, who they are and like, what their struggles are. And I'm looking for like the real juice of the human. I'm not looking for the MBTI answers. And that's why I don't ask, kind of those traditional questions, is because I'm not interested in what someone thinks that they should say. I want to know really how they're thinking about something in the moment, and really getting that unfiltered process. So the way that I look at the functions in typing is going to be the same, with FI and TI as it is with SI and SE. I'm looking for the place of where the energy is spiking because it's in that savior state, it's in that dominant position. As it relates to the functions, it's easy to talk about. There's, the brain isn't thinking about how it should be approaching this subject. And then I'm looking for the areas of fear, the areas of dissonance in that person where they are trying to, there's an underlying factor of what they're trying to avoid in their own selves as it relates to those lower functions. So it's constant triangulation between, the heightened state, the state of flow, like Joyce was mentioning, and the state of fear.
Very good. How about you, Matt Sherman? How do you go about typing people, and what are you looking for in a typing session to decide what judging functions people are using or preferring?
Sure. I'm also from the personality hacker model, so we tend to, at least for my sessions, it's a lot of just talking and bonding kind of. People like to open up to INFPs, and we kind of just, it's a very conversational. I do have a set of questions that I generally stick with or kind of springboard off of. But I'm also there, as Asura Psyche said too, is kind of like a guide. I'm not there. I don't want to tell them specifically their type necessarily. Like, we go through a verification process. Like, this is what's coming up for me. This is what I'm seeing, and we kind of check through there. Just some things to look for. This was also mentioned before. Like, TI is gonna. They constantly ask me to clarify what I'm saying with specific words. And that's generally a sign that, like, okay, all right, well, maybe I should start exploring this function a little bit and see if it kind of resonates. Or being more open with swearing and stuff like that. I mean, seems to happen a lot in sessions too. TEs, I often ask about checklists and how they feel about those. Might light up and all interested in it, might not, but it's something to explore. Expressiveness with FE, and asking introverted feelers, or kind of just using it as a question to see if it fits or not. Asking like, what's more important, for something to make sense, right? So you really understand it, or to have it like resonate deep within your bones as the right thing to do. And it's just constant triangulation, as was mentioned before, and then verification after that. And I personally, as an INFP, I don't like telling people what their type is. I feel it's I'm not the one to be able to actually say that, but I can say what's coming up for me. That's kind of how I approach it, and give some stress relief and support after that, and also looking into the inferior function as well as a big sign. Like, what happens when your life is just going wrong, you've hit a wall or whatever, like when things are not good, what do you do? And kind of using that as a way to check.
I can kind of relate to the not wanting to tell other people what their type is. I
like it.
I wonder if it's just the stage that I'm at in my journey, where I might speculate on people's types in my head, but I really don't like the idea of telling someone else what their type is.
Yeah, it takes me some time.
Michael Pierce, do you have a certain way that you go about typing people? And when you're in a typing session, how do you go about deciding which judging functions people might prefer or be using?
Yeah, I have in the past, actually, I have avoided doing official typing sessions because I haven't felt confident enough in my ability to, with an individual person. I think I have that thing where I don't want to tell people what they are, And I also am very sensitive to the effects that a person believing that they're a type that they're really not can potentially have on them. It's a very tricky situation. The person I aspire to be like, if I were to do lots of typing sessions, is Jack Aaron at World Socionic Society. If you ever get a chance, look at sort of his typing videos. He has a wonderful, I think, he does a wonderful job of, you know, the types of questions he asks, the type of manner that he has with people. So he's like streamed himself typing people, but he does a lot of the things that the rest of you guys have talked about. But he's efficient. I wish I had a list of the questions that he asks. But as far as I go, obviously I have typed plenty of people in my life, sort of informally. And sitting down with somebody, part of the problem, as some people have touched on, is I think the other person has to be ready also. They have to be in the right state of mind that they are willing to be typed. And I think it was Lijo who was saying, I liked what you said about a lot of people will come into, say, a type session or a situation like that already wanting a type, or I've often had people who want me to type them, but it's more because they're skeptical of the system, and they may not even consciously realize they're skeptical and they're kind of being annoying, but there's just deep resistance in them to giving me that kind of psychological power that I would know what their type is. You know, it's like knowing your magical name or something. So people unconsciously resist that. So the other person has to be brave enough to allow this other person to think that they know them on this deeper level. But and they also have to be willing to accept the idea that they have weaknesses, and those weaknesses are very personal to them. They have a deep history to them, and so they have to be very vulnerable. And if they're not, then it's very difficult for me to feel comfortable typing them, because I'm not very good at telling people what I'll often honestly think, which is that, no, you think you're this type, but you're not, but I don't have the heart to tell you, and I don't think that would do any good. So I don't know, I'm not really answering your question, but that's a really tricky one for me. I'm still trying to figure out how to better do that kind of an official session or something like that. Unfortunately, I think I tend to go a lot on intuition, which is why I don't like telling people to type, because I feel like I ought to have better reasons than just, you smell like this type to me, intuitively speaking. It's like I just can tell, I can see, but that's not good enough. That's just my NI, and there's nothing to back it up. So I'm still working on that, to be honest.
Thank you. All right. My next question is, what do you think causes a mistype, both by the typist and by people who self-type, and some practical ways to prevent mistyping? If we want to start with Asura Psyche.
Yeah, I think Pierce just covered a lot of like the things that are really going to cause issues when it comes to typing, and that he's 100% right. And that I've had people who come to typing sessions and they are not ready on a personal level to be typed, or they're either really resilient or they're just, you know, interested in being this one type. And especially if you as the typist are known for being a type, like I run a channel, I'm an INTJ, and therefore I probably have a bias of viewers who are also wanting to be INTJs or INTJs. So I get people coming to me for sessions like thinking they're an INTJ, and it can be so hard to get past that initial step if I don't think they are. I do find that 85-90% of people are pretty okay when it comes to typing sessions. Like I don't meet too many people who are really resistant, but I definitely do meet those people who it's really hard to just crack that initial barrier. When it comes to mistyping, I've had times where I feel like I either couldn't fully grasp someone's type in the hour that we had scheduled together, in which case I will usually ask them to think about our session for like a week or something and then email me and we can talk about it again, because for me it's important to make sure that they at least get something from the session. But I have had times where I've typed someone and then they emailed me and they were like, hey, I don't think I'm actually this type. And they've either booked a second session at like a discounted rate or something, or we've just emailed back and forth about it. And it happens because people change and they grow. And especially if you're going to work with someone who's like, I hate working with people who are under 18 when it comes to typing. It's just really difficult because they don't know themselves. They're changing every 20 minutes in terms of their interests and values. And you know, from the time you're 18 to the time you're 24, you're two different people most of the time. So
they're also looking for they're also looking for what? Pardon me. What's the
You're
right
fine.
word? Not justification, but
Validation.
validation. Thank you. Yeah. That's all I was saying. Sorry, it took me so long. Keep going, sir.
No, it's fine. You're completely right, though. There definitely is people looking for kind of that validation aspect. The guy who's now been my moderator on my Discord server, his name's Madshot. I have a coaching session with him up on my channel. When I initially typed him, I typed him as an INTJ because when he came into our first session, he was like super respectful and private because he wanted to keep up the like TE appearance of being like professional. And then later I typed him as an ENTJ after we got to know each other better. And it's because, you know, those slight misunderstandings of functions and how they portray themselves, especially when you're working with someone who you either have been watching on YouTube, you might even respect them or something along those lines, you can see shifts that make it harder to type people. And overcoming those barriers can be difficult. But the biggest piece of advice is just try to be open-minded about your type when going into a typing session. I think that's the most important thing, is be willing to recognize that you might not be even remotely close to what you thought you were.
Thank you. How about you, Spacey? Looks like you might be busy.
It has a lot to do with I think there's just a lot of misconceptions about what a function entails that gets spread all around the internet. I think people kind of get enamored with these overly simplified or, you know, quite frankly, kind of incorrect kind of definitions or ways that they've seen it explained over and over and over again. So, you know, oftentimes it's a situation of like, well, you know, just because you're an SI type doesn't mean you have the best memory, or just because you're an extrovert doesn't mean that you necessarily like being around people. And there's, you know, little misconceptions like that that need to be cleared up. But, you know, in terms of my ability to type people, like I always know that I could be wrong. And there's, you know, a host of reasons why, based on either the rabbit hole that I decided to go down during that hour that I was typing them, or the way that they were presenting themselves, or the fact that they were really anxious can, you know, cause them to either, you know, fail to give me the information that I need, or, you know, give me kind of an incorrect perception of what kind of a person they are. I guess I'm kind of with Michael Pierce on the fact that it's really not the kind of thing where you're likely to have any sort of empirical basis for why you think they're a certain type, because it's such a fluid and frankly like unscientific deal. But you know, you're gonna have some people who either come in there thinking they're a certain type, or they don't like the type that they were given, and that can be difficult. But I think I handle it pretty well. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, they decided to pay me to tell them what type they are. And if hopefully that's because they've seen what I do and they like the way that I think and the way that I do things. But I'm always perfectly willing to continue to converse with them after the fact. And, you know, usually they'll end up in further conversation with me via email or whatever. You know, they'll reveal a little bit more that oftentimes confirms that I was right, or maybe they'll go and research things a little bit more and they'll compare it to what type they thought they were. And they'll be like, okay, you know what, I can see where you were coming from. You know, sometimes people just aren't satisfied, and I doubt they ever will be, because you're never really going to find the answers that you probably really want regarding who you are when it comes to typology like this. It's really just a tool to help you understand yourself, and I'm not going to be able to tell you who you are.
Thank you. INTJEquation, what do you think causes mistypes both with the typist and the person being typed? And do you have any practical advice for preventing mistypes?
Sorry, having a problem with my mic there. I think a lot of mistyping does come from like internet personality testing. I think they'll kind of like, especially people with like really low TE, they're really like dependent on like a result, like an official result. So they'll cling to that a lot of times. What Chris said, like younger people under 18, they're very kind of turbulent to type because they're bouncing all over the place, just asking their friends what their friends think, and they don't really know themselves yet. And that's the majority of the people that I've talked to so far. And it's very hard to do. And I think older people are harder to type as well because I think their functions have been really individuated and developed. And it's just a little bit trickier when they're older as well. And, you know, it could be very dependent. Like, did you take that test when you were hungry or sleepy or after you had good news? I think the test and the results and the questions could be answered in various different ways. And I think a lot of people get confused and overwhelmed just watching so much content. And, well, this person said this person said that. And yeah, I think it's just a big soul searching process for a lot of people. Like, I really didn't discover this stuff till my late 20s. So I was pretty set in my type, and I was pretty secure and happy with the result, I guess. Well, I took some personality tests. I took 4. I don't remember which ones exactly. I tested INTJ twice, INFJ once, and INTP once. And I really didn't like, I got a 50% result, really, I guess, accuracy. And I kind of just looked up the descriptions vaguely and saw that INTJ fit me the best, and kind of forgot about it for years and kind of came back to it recently.
Okay, thank you. How about you, Joyce? Do you have any advice on how people might mistype each other or themselves, and any practical advice for avoiding mistyping?
Yeah, I agree with everyone. With test worship, it's a real thing. People will get a result on a test and say, this is definitive. Not just with the 16 types, but with every test result they get. They think that it's the end all be all. But I think it's the starting point for discovery. And so oftentimes people end there. They get a test result and that's capiche. There's also meme worship. So people get all of their typology knowledge from memes or some other source that is a little bit questionable. There's some truth to it, but also some non-truth to it as well. And so a lot of typing is also correcting misconceptions, like the ones that Spacey mentioned about SI users. They don't always have good memory. And a lot of extroverts will think that they're introverts initially. Even Oprah, she said in her loud, gregarious FE voice, I'm an introvert on live television. So even an FE Dom thinks that they're an introvert. So with TE dominant types, they sometimes identify as introverted because their form of extroversion is not oriented towards people. And sometimes people can slow down getting the thing done, and so people can be annoying. And so those are things to factor in as well. There's also human error too. Typology professionals, I don't care who it is, even if they say they're the god of type, no one gets everyone's types correctly 100%. And so I think there's a little bit of humbleness that the practitioner needs to have sometimes, because maybe you're meeting a really weird case of a certain type. You don't know how many subtypes there are within a type, and if you've miscategorized someone as a type that they may not officially be. And the person getting typed might have an incorrect view of themselves. And so that can be tricky because people can get really emotionally tied to their type. Because as Lijo said at the beginning, people feel like it's the first time they've been understood before. And so then they go like, I'm for sure this type because it made me feel understood. And then if the typologist may disagree, it might cause some emotional upset because they have to change the paradigm within their mind of who they are. And that's tough. So I would just say it's humbleness because it's an art sometimes to type someone. I'll ask people in the follow-up emails if they decide that their type is another type than the one that we typed them as. I'd like to know why and just their journey if they'd want to email me about it. Because above all, I want to be accurate. So that's my goal with typing. And then I changed the TI framework or the Jenga tower I have in my mind to a company if I think that they're right, to see, oh, could they actually be a subtype of this? So it's a humbling experience. But I find that sometimes it takes a person a while to actually be comfortable around typologists too. Sometimes they'll get typed by multiple people, like 5 or 10 people. And sometimes it takes the correct person to then go like, oh, you're this type. And it's not because the other typologists that typed them before were necessarily bad at typing. It's because people choose what they share during sessions. So it's not until that person getting typed feels comfortable actually talking about themselves that a typologist can arrive at a correct opinion. Also, with my typing services, I try to remain as unbiased as possible. So the other person I'm typing with, we do a double blind. So we arrive separately at a result and we see where we get at. 9 out of 10 times it's the same type. And from that, we ask the person after what their journey was and if they agree or disagree, and we have a dialogue, because ultimately, if there's going to be anything productive coming out of it, I find that dialogues are the most way to get value the most, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Lijo, how do you go about sorry,
I gotcha.
my brain just stopped for a second. Preventing
So
mistyping and how people might mistype each other and themselves. You seen any of that?
yeah, so as it relates to me, what I always tell people is, I can tell you what I'm seeing within the hour that we have together. And, that hour that we have, it can what I'm seeing, oh gosh, here's my dog. It I can just give you my perspective within, the time that we have. And you can then take that and do whatever you want with it, right? Now, what I also aim to do though is, because when I'll go through and I do a lot of questioning and then I'm writing notes as this person is talking. And then I go through and I reflect on my notes with them saying, these are some things I was hearing on this direction, some things in the other direction. And what I really aim to do is outside of, giving a type, right? Which, as everyone's saying, it's like you have to have this very humbled approach of, you can miss things, you can, overlook certain parts, and depending on how open the person is, and that's all very possible. But what I aim to do is bring value in terms of the reflection outside of type. So, whether someone's the type that they want to be or not, I can say, through what you're saying, I'm seeing these areas as being a challenge, right? And I'm seeing these areas as being a strength. I'm seeing this as a place of development. I'm seeing this as a place of, you don't have to worry about it. You're doing so much better at this thing than anyone else. Like I've talked to, you have no idea how strong you are in this area. And so outside of getting a type, I think there's a lot of value to just reflecting with a person on you as being, a third party of of how of how they're seeing their own lives and how you're seeing their own life. And I think what's so valuable about, being in the typology community, and especially getting to type people, is you get to see the spectrum of humans that are out there. And so you'll have this like really, extroverted person who thinks they're, very introverted. And it's like, man, compared to some of the introverts who I've talked with, you have no idea like how much energy you have towards these areas of life compared to the spectrum, And so I think that allows for some good insight to come through. But again, like I said, I can tell people what I'm seeing within that hour, and then it's up to them to, take that and hopefully do some good with it. As it relates to, self-typing and doing the tests and stuff like that online, I think what's really interesting about the test, and what really will skew things, is like you'll get questions like, do you prefer to be organized or go with the flow more? And it's like, you could have the J person answer that like, oh, I prefer to be organized. And then you could have the P type also, say, I want to be organized. But it's like, well, why are they answering that way? And it's like, the ENTJ could say, I like to be organized because, you know, at the end of the day, I fear chaos, right? It's like a fear of mine. So I have to do everything I can to avoid it. And the result of doing that avoidance is being extremely organized with how I'm, you know, rolling out my life. Or you could have, you know, the EP be like, oh yeah, I prefer to be organized because they're living in a state of chaos so much of the time that, you know, when they actually get the reprieve of having some organization, it brings some more peace to their life, right? So they could also prefer it, but for a different reason in context. And so I think that's where a lot of mistypings come from, is that, you know, we can all have certain preferences, we can all have certain behaviors, but it's the why behind that that is the driving force of the cognitive process.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. How about you, Matt? How do you think people mistype each other and themselves? And do you have any practical tips for preventing mistyping?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody's pretty much said a lot of it, but I spend 2 hours on my sessions. Usually one and a little bit is kind of just building rapport and connecting with them, and then the last half is me verifying and saying, you know, just kind of like giving them a lot of information, which is sometimes, you know, sometimes good, sometimes bad. Sometimes, you know, sensors might kind of glaze over a little bit if I start giving them too much information about it. But it's also I'm verifying and I'm checking as I'm doing that. And if there's like, yeah, I don't really think that's true, then I can in there and explain it a bit more, or I can check, you know, maybe I had a wrong perception on it. And that's all fine. A lot of people, as was mentioned before, like I call them collectors. Like they'll come in and like I was typed by these 6 people. I don't know. Can you type me? And it's like kind of like a challenge, and that comes with in hypnosis too. People do that too. Like my mind's so strong, I don't think you can hypnotize me. Like, well, what's your goal with this session? If you're spending the money, do you want to just talk about personality type? We can do that. That's fine too. Or want to like open up a bit and we can kind of maybe expose some vulnerabilities and strengths and stuff like that. And you know, I find it as like a whole, it's important to go on this journey of self-discovery. Me just saying that you are this type, I don't really think helps a lot. You know, signs, guideposts, you know, certain quests to go on, that's good, but you know, I want them to discover about themselves and for me to honor that as well and their strengths. And like I think Lijo was saying too, like really good at this, like let's talk about this, like let's talk about how you did this stuff in your life, and maybe some of the strengths and weaknesses with that too. There's a lot of misconceptions with everything, but I think extroversion introversion was one of the bigger ones. I mean, Joyce said it too. I had an ENTJ friend who said he was an introvert, and we were talking, and going down to the deeper reasons for why they do the things that they do is extremely important. He was just like, I don't like being around people and stuff like that. I was like, well, why? It's because people get in the way of me doing stuff. I don't have time for that. Okay, that's, you know, that's a little bit different. We need to talk about that and explain what that is, to get rid of some of those misconceptions. Also, I take a lot of notes so that I can refer specifically to what they said, like quotes. So I can kind of unpack those and say, well, remember when you said this? This is why I think it's this function. We can talk about that a little bit more, which is kind of why I give so much time to the typing sessions. That's it.
That makes a lot of sense. How about you, Michael? How do you have you experienced people typing themselves and each other incorrectly, and how do you go about preventing mistypes?
Yeah. Yeah, I was trying to think of what I would say. Again, it's tricky because I don't like I said before, I don't like to tell people, you know, and I think that's often rather rude because I've also seen the opposite where people become convinced that somebody is a type and that person really is typed correctly, and they will be trying to like needle them to. So I've seen that happen too, but I think the two things that help to prevent it is, one of them, again, going back to the person themselves, I think the trait that I've seen in the people who have been typed correctly is that they're very, there's a different sense to them often, where they are like, yeah, I'm this type, and it doesn't define everything about me, but I feel confident in it, and oh, you know, INFPs be like this or whatever. But it's like there's this weird sense that they've fully accepted it, and therefore, ironically, they kind of transcend it a little bit, like because they've so fully accepted it. They're much more confident, and they don't mind other people knowing what their type is. There's a courage or a bravery there, actually, I think, that is really important to help avoid mistyping. I mean, because if you're scared of what you think you are or what you think other people will think that you are, in regards to type, then it will be, I mean, really, even if you are typed correctly, you'll still vacillate because you're, because you're scared of what other people will think of you, or you're scared of some aspect of yourself that you don't want to face. I kind of realize that I've made it almost a pseudo-moral question. I don't want to do that, but the only other thing is, oh shoot, it was something that Joyce had mentioned actually. You used the term worship, which I think is funny. Meme worship, but that is another problem I have seen, and I don't know how to fix this. But you know, you have the censor bias, or the anti-censor bias, which I think has been improved a lot since I've been in the community, but. For people who are not super interested in type, I've struggled where I've been like, oh, I think you're an ESFJ, and they're like, well, I typed as ENFJ, and the N means that it's objectively better. They don't say that, but you can tell because they've read the descriptions for ENFJ, and it's like, oh, they're creative. ENFJs are creative and they'll change the world, and ESFJs, oh, they make wonderful house servants or something, and it's like, you know what I mean? And it's like, oh, God. So that's something that's more just, that I think has been improving and making it so that people can read the descriptions and realize, it's one of the things I was trying to do with my videos, was saying everybody can be a hero, you know, everybody can be this amazing historical figure. So I feel like I went off. I always feel like I went off someplace with my rambling. I always ramble, but I hope that adds some more to it.
Thank you, thank you. As some of you know, I've been in a few typing sessions myself, and I think one of the things to avoid is taking what happens in that 1 hour of that person's life, like, super literally. Like, if I'm in a typing session and someone's asking me questions and it involves a story, they're asking about my past and it involves a story, and I go off on a few tangents, they might correlate that to be me being initiating. Or I think it's important to stay away from certain narratives too. Like if a typist has a narrative, TE users, TE inferior cares about what everybody thinks. And then use that narrative to say, well, that person wore a hoodie to an interview, so they don't care much about what other people think. I think it's important to avoid those types of narratives, and to also realize that this is 1 hour of this person's life, and that there might not make too many assumptions too quickly in that typing session.
Can I add something real quick I thought of? I'm speaking out of turn, I'm sorry. But along with that too, and I've actually been happy, not that I'm really in a position to judge, as I don't really type people officially very often, but I was happy that one of the things I've heard a lot is essentially it's, because I know with myself when typing people, one of the things I've noticed is I'll get nervous because it's like if I don't type them correctly, then they'll think I'm a fraud, and then they'll like organize an angry mob and come kill me or something. You know, it's like that's what my body is thinking, not my mind. But and so as a result of that, that's why you fall into, or you're much more likely to fall into the narratives you were just talking about, where you're desperate and you're looking for, okay, they're doing that. Okay, that's NE. They're doing the NE thing. Okay, so they're definitely NE, and then you can feel more official, and it's like you got to relax and you got to be okay with, you know, you may not type them correctly the first session, or maybe you need more sessions, you know, or something like that. It's a lot like therapy. I mean, I liked that comparison that's been made. So.
Right. And I think it too, it's important to realize that it can take time to learn how a person makes decisions, how they see the world, and what's internal to them. And probably just in general, typing someone if you type someone very quickly, I think that can lead to mistyping, especially if you really want to stick to that typing once you've made your decision. I think that can kind of cause problems and mistypes. Let's see.
Yeah, I honestly, an hour isn't really enough time. I mean, you have to get to know somebody to actually type them accurately. I mean, even 2 hours isn't enough time, but I do like that. What's her name? Matt? Yeah, I like that he does 2 hour sessions. It's probably better. If I had more time, I would probably prefer to do that. And I think it also helps, like Joyce does, is to have another person or perhaps multiple people for redundancy, because you'll have different perspectives coming at it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason I do 2 hours is because it takes a bit for me to actually make a firm decision like, with my head. Right? But also, I do feel that it's important to like get past all the blockages and stuff like that, and actually get to know somebody a bit better. Although, in many ways, I think we can maybe all agree that like sometimes it's easier to type people within a very short time, because you're like, oh, you're this type, and then from there, you can go on verifying and stuff like that. But the more you get to know somebody, you're like, oh yeah, might be this, it might be this, oh, it could be this, and you just like, at least for me, I just start to spiral out.
I mean, hell, I've had some people who can't even make it through an hour. They start to get antsy, and it's like they're done. But
yeah,
it's almost like you gotta have that first intuition. I always compare it to smell, because that's like the most primitive intuition sense, I think. It's like you get a whiff and you're certain, but then you go through the process of the doubting, and then hopefully you'll come back around, and then you'll be super certain. It's like you super tight. I cut somebody off. My apologies.
I think the most.
You go ahead, Joyce.
Yeah, I think the most surefire way to type someone is to live with them. So if I guess typologists had that option and it wasn't like weird, because you would have to see how they actually deal with situations. Someone can actually tell you how they deal with a situation, but it's not until you it's actually verified. Oh, I live with you. You did recount it correctly. All right, you definitely are that type that you can be 10,000% sure. And so I find with typing sessions, it takes a bit of trusting the other person and what they're saying too. And so with typing, I totally forgot my point. I had a point, I'll get back to it, but Asura Psyche, Chris, you can go.
I kind of lost my track too. I was gonna say that earlier you mentioned that like certain temperaments tend to be really easy to notice in typing sessions. For example, like EJs, I tend to more often than not really the easiest people to type. Occasionally you might have like that weird mix up where maybe they're like an IJ or something, but like EJs tend to be so straightforward that they get through my list of questions in like half the time that everyone else. Even the FE DOMs, it's going to take them a little longer than the TE DOMs, but the TE DOMs are like rushing through these questions almost. And then I get to the IPs and we're 15 minutes over the hour and they're still not done with the list of questions, let alone the discussion that we haven't started yet.
Feel like I'm being called out a little bit there.
One of
really
my
Oh, go ahead.
one of my favorite things to do kind of like towards the end of a typing session is like when I'm starting to like really narrow it on what I'm seeing as someone's like strengths, like, you know, their dominant functions, I start to think about the questions that would be hard for them to answer. And so like as it relates to like the whole EJ thing, you know, I've seen that as well. Usually the EJs can like blow through a lot of questions and I'm like, well, this person really were to be TE first, they should really have a hard time, you know, telling me about some of the things that they just like doing, you know, for like no reason, the things that they just like to do without, you know, really any purpose behind it. And so it's always fun to kind of like stump people on the flip side, but that's also helping you triangulate as well, right? So it's like, well, you know, if I am tracking this correctly, then this person should have a harder time answering this kind of a question. And then if that proves to be true, okay, well then that's, you know, one more tick on the side of this is likely the type. If it doesn't prove to be true, well, you get to backtrack and be like, okay, well now where my I have strayed off the path, you know, what am I maybe not seeing correctly? And then, you know, that'll take some more time.
Right, I think so too. I think I just thought of another thing about like taking the typing session too literally and paired with and pairing it with like not wondering like why someone is doing a certain thing. Like I'll just use myself as an example. I uttered the phrase, I don't know how I feel about that, when what was really happening is I was having trouble expressing how I felt about something. That narrative was used with pretty kind of the stereotypes was going that T people are the ones that don't know how they feel, and I got typed as a thinker pretty quickly because of that utterance.
I've had FI dominant types answer in a similar way. They'll say something like, I don't know what I feel, but they say that because they're feeling all the time. They're calibrating their emotional response to things all the time. It's almost so subconscious that they have a hard time articulating how often they do it. So it can be misleading what you hear at the beginning, which is why it's so important to ask why. And so one of the techniques I also do during typing sessions sometime with Michael Pierce, he said smelling people's type. If I can smell someone's type within the first 5 minutes or the beginning of a session, I'll write it down on my piece of paper and I'll try my hardest to disprove it. And I'll go like, all right, if I think they're this type, I'm going to try to see all the vantage points where I can disprove that and see if it still holds up.
Joyce, I do the exact same thing. I call it my vibe type. Within like the first 2 or 3 minutes, some people just give off like a really strong, I don't know what it is, but I'm feeling something here, and it really makes me think this type. And then, as you said, you have to kind of like fight to disprove it instead of trying to fight to prove it.
I actually think that's great because that makes it. It wouldn't be correct probably to call it more scientific, but because you have almost this layer of falsifiability where instead of sort of reaching out into the void for 16 types and you can't even keep 16 things in your head at the same time, you get a whiff of one type and you're like, cool, let me see if I can falsify, as it were, that type and see if there's enough things that make it so that doesn't make sense. And then so that almost would be like a more scientific way of trying to go about it in that sense anyway.
My vibe type sounds like a dating app or something like that. I was just gonna say, yeah, I think testing, trying to break the assumptions is really good. There's also something within neurolinguistic programming. It's a presupposition that's you can't not communicate. But anything that people are doing are saying something about their type in some way, whether it's the hesitations, whether it's their struggle to answer certain questions or wanting clarification on certain things. So it's not just the words, right? It's all the things that they're doing. Sometimes that is hard to pick up because we're trying to pay attention to everything and like label this person in some way. But I think that's one important thing, like where are they stopping? How fast are they speaking? How slowly are they speaking? Where are they kind of fumbling over things? It's just ways of like triangulating and like a compass, right? Trying to figure out where you are and help them with that. Also, one thing, I hope it's okay to say this, asking like if they feel there's a need to show up as a certain type, like if they're really stuck on something, or if they keep saying stuff that just something's not quite matching up in your head, because it could be the environment, it could be the family context or something like that. Like they've been trained to do, TE stuff, and maybe that's not natural to them necessarily from like a type perspective. So asking if they're kind of bringing any of that on, or if they feel like it's better to be a certain type or something like that, it kind of give you some ways of helping them move forward with whatever their type journey is.
Right.
That's actually this will be my last comment on this. I think that's actually a really good question, because then you're just confronting it directly, which I suppose could backfire in certain situations, but I feel like it'd be really good if you literally are just like, is there a type that you like? Be honest with me, like, which type would you love to be? Like, and if the answer is I don't care, that's a good sign. But if they're honest with you at that point and are like, listen, man, I really want to be an INFJ because I just feel like I'm garbage and they were special and they'll make me feel special. And it's like, cool, now we can talk a little more about, then it almost becomes more like a therapy session. But, presumably the reasons that they want to be a certain type will, in fact, reflect their own type to a certain extent. I knew I had a friend who was an ISFP, I believe. There's no way to know for absolute certain, but ISFP, but decided he was probably an INFJ. And it was just so clear that he was struggling with certain things. There was some depression involved and everything, and this was, but the way in which he wanted to be an INFJ was so kind of ISFP, because he wouldn't give any really clear reasons, and it was more of he was staring into the sunset, like Gatsby looking at the green light across the waters, like there's the INFJ. I'm like, oh, my dear friend. But anyway, we could move on.
Awesome. Oh, I was muted. Awesome. This is a two-part question. I know some of you probably don't use 8 function models, but my question, the first part of it is, can what the type that the typist is impact their ability to type certain types? And I'm especially thinking about someone's 7th function. In some systems has been called the polar function, the trickster function, and some I've heard narratives about that being the function that one is the least aware of. And so the two-part question is, does your type as a typist affect your ability to type certain types? And if you use an 8 function model, does that 7th function have an impact on your ability to see that function? For an example, if you're an INTP, your trickster function would be extroverted sensing. Would you have trouble identifying that function in someone?
I'll start, I guess.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I don't use a. Sorry, what was the first part of the question? I know you just said it.
Does the type of the typist impact
That's
their
right.
ability to type certain types?
Yeah, I think definitely. Of course, it kind of is easier to type people who are your own type, as long as you're like mature enough to recognize that you are not the representative of your type, which is something that is, I think, people can fall dangerously into when they're typing people. Like, oh, this person's not like me, so therefore they're not an INTJ or an INFJ. And that was a struggle that I had kind of when I initially first started typing, because it was like I would meet other people that I would type as INTJs, and they just like had different values than me. They had different interests than me, and like getting over that hump initially takes time for typists. And it's an ego thing where maybe you don't want to be associated with these people who are so far different than you, even though they use the same cognitive processes. In terms of 8 function models, I do not use an 8 function model. I stick with a 4 function model, so I can't really have much input on this question.
Thank you for that. How about you, Spacey? Do you have any thoughts on the type of the typist impacting their typing, and if you use the 8-function model, does that trickster function have an impact?
I don't really think there's a clear answer to that question. I guess maybe as like an INTP, for example, I find it pretty easy to recognize TI in people even without them necessarily saying anything that sounds very logical or anything along those lines. Like I think it can be easier to identify some of your own functions in other people. It may be more difficult to type other people the same type as yourself sometimes, although it could just be that I don't actually get a lot of INTPs. There was one guy from like China who I ended up typing as an INTP, so he was coming from a completely different place, but I mean, it was still pretty clear to me. I think most INTPs probably aren't likely to, and I guess in comparison to other types, like go pay somebody to type them, they'll probably be more likely to figure it out themselves, maybe. I think there's a little bit of that going on. I use 8 functions, but when it comes to like using the polar to type people, I think that usually will lead you astray more often than help you type somebody. Like there's too many times where like there's ENFPs who are actually brilliant people who display a total logical streak that it's often hard for them to understand how they can be like TI polar when they think very rationally in a lot of ways. I don't know. I really don't. It's too hard to like take like your model and overlay it over them and try to be like, oh, this looks like that function in 7th slot, and this looks like that function in 4th slot, because there's way too many overlaps. 4th slot can often look like 5th slot. It totally depends on the person. It's just completely out of whack. I think it maybe some types are just better at typing people than other types, maybe not. It's hard to say any of this definitively. So I'm certain that the type of the typologist has some impact. But what that impact is, I couldn't say.
Okay, yeah, that does make sense. How about you, INTJEquation?
By the way, I'm sorry, guys, but I actually have to dip out. I was planning on staying longer.
Thank you for
It's
joining
a
us
pleasure,
today.
sir.
See you later.
Yeah, nice to see you guys.
Good to meet you.
Okay, so there's a type of the typist kind of gonna miss up things. Yeah, I think it could vary. Like I said, I haven't done much like professional typing or whatever, like like as a service. Most of the typing I do is kind of just observing other people talk, and I do observe that other people react differently with other types. So it could definitely be a variation there. And what exactly did you ask about an 8-function model, like the trickster function?
Right, so some people would say that in an 8-function model, the 7th function is the function that people are the least aware of, and therefore it might be difficult to type someone using that function in a higher slot.
Yeah, I mean, if they're kind of like they keep making like a social taboo or something, I think it's really indicative of like FE trickster, or kind of like they might say something offensive and they don't mean to. It can definitely kind of narrow it down to certain other types. But I think it is easier kind of to type off the ego, but I can definitely kind of identify those types down in the shadow side, or the a little bit better in a certain sense. And I know there's another part to the question. It was a really big question.
Just the type of the typist can affect the typing.
Yeah, I kind of do have the most trouble spotting other INTJs. I think kind of like when with your own type, or even like when your own quadra, you can kind of rub each other the wrong way a lot of times. So I think it can definitely affect it, and they might want to talk to somebody a little bit differently, and yeah, I think it could just vary. Like I said, I don't have a whole lot of experience like talking to someone one-on-one typing people. I just kind of observe them from a distance. So I'm just getting started.
Right. How about you, Joyce? Do you have any thoughts on the type of the typist affecting a typing?
Yeah, I'm a bit like a counselor, so people tell me their issues that they've had in other typing services. And the complaint I hear the most often is actually there's a certain kind of person where they tell me everyone that I've been typed with, they type me as their type. So if they've been typed by an INFJ, they get typed INFJ. If they get typed by an INTP, they get typed INTP. If they get typed by an ENFP, they get typed ENFP. I'm like, this is an interesting type of case. I find that my type doesn't really change how I type people, but I notice that there's that certain bias with a certain group of people. And I think I can call these people the chameleon people because they chameleon to the typist. So whatever the typist says, they're like, yeah, and then the typist just ends up thinking that the person is exactly like them. So that's something I notice. With the 8 function model, with Personality Hacker, they have an ethics against using the 8 function model for typing sessions. So I use it for after typing. So when people actually know their type, I'll bring them through the 8 function model. But I don't typically use it for typing. The reason why is because a lot of things can look like a lot of things. With polar TE, there are a lot of types that can look like they have polar TE. For instance, with TE repressed people in the INFP and the ISFP, they just naturally suck at TE because it's their last function. And so is that polar TE? It's very easy to mix that up. And even with INTPs, they're not the most TE sometimes, so they might look polar TE. And so there's some hardness to type there, although I think there's value in all schools of thought in typology. So after typing someone, I might bring up these new models, but I tend to keep it simple when I type people, and I just use the 4 functions. Then the other 4 come in after. But I find it relatively easy sometimes to spot extroverted thinking in some people, because for some people it's very obvious. For other people, it's more difficult. So it's more of a case-by-case basis thing.
Right, yeah, that makes sense to me too. How about you, Lijo? Do you have any thoughts about how the type of the typist can affect the typing? And I'm not sure if you use an 8 function model, but wonder if you have any thoughts on that too.
Yeah, yeah, how I see it usually kind of play out for myself, and I don't particularly use an 8 function model, but I see like the different function axes as almost as dialects. And so, if there's a country, right, and you have these different dialects that exist within the country, if you live in a particular area, the dialects near you, you're going to be likely more familiar with, and the ones farther away from you are going to be maybe a little bit different, a little bit more foreign to understand. So I see that very much the same way when it comes to typing, is as I'm starting to listen to a person and hear their process through what they're saying, it's usually the function axes that I have. It doesn't matter which function is above the other, but those axes I'll start to hear more clearly if their dialect is close to mine. So if they're on the FITE axis, right, I'll start to hear that language. Whereas if someone's on the FETI axis, it's like I'll have to listen longer before I'm able to start like defining what I'm hearing. So it's just kind of like it's like a proximity thing, right? If the proximity is closer to you, it's often going to kind of pop out clear. At least this is my experience, And if it's farther from you, it's not that you can't understand it. It's like you have to listen a little bit more closely and be like, what am I actually hearing here?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How about you, Matt? Do you have any thoughts on the type of the typist affecting the typing? That's like a tongue twister there.
Type of effect is correct. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's because a lot of INFPs come to me, as Chris was saying too, like with INTJs and stuff like that. Like, I tend to feel that most of them are INFPs, and a lot of them are. Some of them aren't, but like, I always have to check myself and like know that like, am I bringing my baggage or triggers into the session? Like, if somebody shows up with certain aspects, like I gotta check myself before I can really understand where they're coming from and what their type is as well. I don't know about like seventh function in a typing session. I don't tend to look at the last four.
Mhm.
Yes, I mean, I could generally tell if somebody is using extroverted sensing, I think, pretty easily just based off how they're come about. But like introverted feeling, I mean, so many introverted feelers can be like, well, I can see myself in every type. So, you know, the ISFPs like constantly wondering like what is their actual type, and INFPs as well. It's not related to the seventh function, but I think that's just one of the hangups that can kind of come about, at least from my perspective, because I can also resonate with their struggle and their journey as well. I think it really just comes down to experience and getting a lot of sessions under your belt so that you actually know what's presenting as what. I don't know if that answered your question at all, but
Yeah, that was
there's some words.
How about you, Michael? Do you have any thoughts about the type of the typist affecting the typing? And
The type
if
of the
you
typist affecting the typing.
and if you ever use an 8-function model, do you have any theories about that seventh function being out of the typist awareness?
Yeah. Yeah. As far as the type of the type, I actually think I am inclined towards what Joyce said. My first instinct is to say I don't think it's weird, right? Because it sounds like it'd be something that'd be like super important, like because that's the whole idea behind type is it's like your inner biases and things. But I don't think I think it absolutely could. I don't think it has to. And I think that's the thing about type in general is you can transcend it for you know certain purposes. So I and I also wouldn't be I couldn't say, you know, I don't know if I could predict how somebody's type, the type of the typer could affect the typing per se. I suppose you could make predictions about that and that'd be interesting, but I haven't seen it myself. As far as an 8-function model, I've never like referred to myself as using an 8-function model. I keep referencing my book, but in my book, I sort of reconcile myself to it in the sense of, you know, it even, you know, whether or not you talk about people having the function as though there were like a part of their DNA or something that was the, oh, this is the FE part of the DNA, and there's less, it's like, I don't know, but you certainly have an attitude towards it as a result of your preferences. And so in that sense, you can definitely talk about people having innate function. But yeah, it would get very confusing using that in typing. But I feel like there's a lot of potential to the idea of the polar function because yay, look everyone, it's my book. It's
awesome.
It's called Motes and Beams, everybody. You make me
Buy
so
it
happy.
now.
In that book, Joyce would probably know this. In that book, I actually use the polar function because, you know, if you take the dominant function and then the polar function, it's kind of, you know, theoretically in sort of a socionic sense, those are like the two opposite poles. Because I think, if I've observed correctly, that the polar function is, I think it's the thing that the person gets most angry about. And it's tricky. I don't think there's any hard and fast rules for detecting it, so this isn't necessarily good for typing. But I have noticed in myself and in others that now and then you'll find that, you know, it's like you have to find the part of them that they still aren't conscious of, and so they still don't know like the proper answers. Like you'll meet INTJs who you know have learned much better than other INTJs for whatever reason. Oh, if somebody does an FE-ish sort of thing with me, I respond in this way. And so it's like you won't be able to poke them. They've fortified their FE. But if you find the right spot, you know, if you're, and I'm trying to think of an example, but, you know, you may not get it with, oh, you know, how do you feel in trying to put on a face in front of other people? But if you get them on a more philosophical point of view, such as, you know, how do you feel about the opinions of the majority or something like this? That's not a good example, but I think you know what I'm trying to get at there. I think there's benefit there if we can learn how to harness it, but I don't know quite how to do that. But
Awesome. I know that we are
I gotta
running
go.
pretty late. I don't know if anyone wants to stick around for questions, but I am very thankful that you guys not only showed up to hang out with me today, but stayed this long. I really appreciate it a lot. I feel like I learned so much just from this talk. I'm probably about to watch this VOD like 3 times over. I'll be downloading it as soon as the 48-hour mark goes through. And after that, I'll start editing. It'll probably take me about a week to get it on YouTube. Does anyone have anything they'd like to discuss here, add on? I don't see any questions in the chat. Probably
I
because
gotta go. I just want to say thank you. Thanks
thank
for
you.
hosting this. Thanks everybody. It was great seeing you and meeting you. And I have construction outside too. So
Yeah, we can
it was
hear
a
you. No worries,
pleasure,
man.
man.
Take it easy.
It was great
Later.
talking.
Yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat. Do you guys have anything you'd like to add before we kind of close up? Or if I don't know if you've seen the questions I sent out, but if any of the bottom 5 that I was kind of reluctantly considering discussing, if any of those were of special interest, we could cover that if anyone has time.
Can I comment on 2 of them real
Yeah.
quick? The number 4 you have here, do you think type can shift or change over time? Ironically, well, I guess not properly ironically, but my thoughts themselves have shifted or changed on that question. I guess technically my answer is still no, but I definitely think, because I think type is something very deep and fundamental, and we still haven't figured out what it even is yet, but I definitely think that, because, I mean, first and foremost, I've seen it in myself, but I've also seen it in other people. To give a kind of sad example, I do think I had 2 friends who went through what can only be described as traumatic experiences, and after those experiences, while they were still the same type, I do feel like there were changes that occurred as a result of PTSD that could only, lasting changes that could only be described as a shift in elements of how they expressed. So it's almost like they remained that core type, but they took on, like I had one friend who before was very much, I think, an ENFJ, a more kind of typical, the more sort of happy ENFJ, much more FE focused. But then after the experience, there became this much more focus on SE and almost taking on certain elements that were almost INTJ-ish, where all of a sudden they were like really good at like video games and stuff, and they would trounce me, whereas before, like they became more strategic in this weird way. And they were still an ENFJ, but it's kind of hard to describe, but there was definitely a shift there. So I think that definitely severe experiences can shift how these things are expressed and can make the type question even more complicated for them. But so I just have become sort of passionate about that. And I just wanted to say also that as far as Enneagram goes, because that's another one of your questions, was I do think it can change how people express their types, but I don't have any more to add on that because I haven't studied it enough. But I do think that that is another complicating factor, is it can be the Enneagram, and that it can help explain why people of the same type can seem so characteristically different from each other. Like Asura and INTJEquation. I'm sure you're both INTJs, but you seem very different kinds of INTJs, if I may say so. Just from watching you in here. So that's an interesting question.
I think a lot of it goes, I'm very interested in trauma and how it affects typology. I think one interest that I do have is trauma and personality disorders. I think certain types can develop certain personality disorders like myself, I am affected by avoidant personality disorder, and it's something that I'm struggling and working to get out of. So I'm kind of gearing myself to work for like unhealthy INTJs, I guess, and kind of figure that out. Yes.
Yeah, a lot of things can influence the presentation of a type, especially, when it comes to disorders and things like even like attachment styles. I know is something that we've seen a lot of talk about in type community recently. Um, and I just think, yeah, there's so many variations of each type, but I don't see them all as like distinct different categories. To me, when I look at a type, one of the criticisms I have of objective personality is that I don't think like the jumper types, like an NIFI, INTJ, is its own separate category. It's an evolutionary step or cycle that an INTJ could fall into along their journey, but it's open to change. So therefore, you can see these kind of lifespan changes of how the type presents itself, given the functions that they have.
I almost feel like that that can be both a sign of unhealthiness, but also great healthiness, depending on how. Because we talk about integrating more functions and kind of this pseudo Jungian sense, and I've seen it both ways, where you have people who mistype themselves because they really want to be a certain type, but then you also have people who seem, as they get older and grow through experiences, in a way they become more their type, but that's because they've learned more about how to integrate these other functions. It's really interesting seeing that, how almost they become more whole, but as they become more whole, they become even more like their type, but they're like the best version. I don't know, that maybe that sounds a little Maslow holistic psychology happy stuff, but it's just interesting.
One thing I tried to correlate a few months back was I did a stream on trying to relate the Jungian 12 archetypes to personality types, and how you could have like an INTJ who was in a different archetype within those 12 archetypes, and that would represent like different versions of INTJs, for example. Like you might have one that seeks knowledge as their ultimate desire, or you might have one like myself. I said I seek mastery over the things that I interact with, and I think that might influence like how an INTJ develops, or how any type develops, like what is important to them as a core value.
With Jung, he never really talks about the auxiliary and the tertiary function. He just talks about the dominant and the counterpoint to the dominant function. So oftentimes, how I see the function stack is that your dominant function definitely is the dominant function, and your inferior or oppressed is your last function, and that's definitely there. But I find the placement within the two, they teeter-totter sometimes, and like what Chris was saying, there's sometimes an evolution where you go between them two. Some periods of my life I feel way more TI oriented, and other periods I feel more FE oriented, but it feels like an evolution of myself. So it's just something interesting. I see it as imbalanced and out of balance rather than a set function order. Your dominant and your last function are out of balance, and the middle two functions are in balance. So whatever one is stronger, it's kind of arbitrary sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was
I
just
often find that those center two functions, and Joyce, I asked you a question earlier in your stream today to poke at this a little bit, as I find those two center functions tend to be at conflict in what they want to do in a given situation. Because like if as an INTJ, for me, sometimes I like to pick the FI choice over the TE one, even if the TE one's better. And sometimes I don't. Sometimes I really need that like snappy, all right, let's get it done type of choice.
As a self-identified INFJ, that is the daily struggle, the FETI struggle. Do I tell them what they want to hear? And that almost always wins out, but or do I stick to my guns almost to an irrational point? But yeah. You must forgive me. I have a oh, sorry, Joyce. You go ahead.
I'm an INFJ, and my FE typically wins out, but they do fight with each other often.
Yeah. I was going to say, you can turn me down, but Lijo, I'm like, come enter the conversation. See, that's more of my Effie. I'm like,
Yeah.
Lijo, you seem left out. I want to know what you have to say. Though you probably don't, and that's why you haven't said anything. But I want you to feel included. So, sorry.
Thank you. No, it's just interesting listening to everyone's perspectives. I think like, as it relates to the functions and like their position, uh, I think it very much is tied to our genetics. There actually is a lot of genetic studies that have been done as it relates to personality type and like elements of personality type. And there's really interesting things that they're discovering about epigenetics and methylation and how this kind of imprints certain aspects of our DNA with these kinds of traits. And so I'm excited of where that's going. I think that we're only going to solidify this field more in terms of a science versus having it float into like the pseudoscience field, which is what I think a lot of people like to attribute it to. And as it relates to someone touched on like mental health and different kinds of disorders as it relates to type, where I've kind of seen interesting patterns with that is I feel like type itself in terms of the functions is very much a pattern. And so, as you're assessing a type and you're looking at type, you're looking and finding pattern, right? But where I find, different disorders come in is it's not so much it changes type necessarily, but what it does is like it takes pieces out of the pattern. So, like let's say you had a striped, shirt or something like that, and it was like red, yellow, blue, red, yellow, blue, right? That's the type almost, right? But then when you're seeing some certain kinds of disorders, it's almost like there's colors missing out of that in places where it shouldn't be. And so that's at least, that's been my observation so far and kind of where I've come to and how I can talk about it. But I think it is a really interesting paradigm when you're looking at, and depends, of course, it depends on what kind of, disorder you're looking at. But I've definitely seen it. It's like more taking out of the pattern versus changing the pattern.
I'm playing with an idea in my head because I just read most of Gifts Differing. I'm not quite done with it yet. In Gifts Differing, they point out that how important it is to consider the auxiliary function, and that it's probably not healthy to lean so much on your one introverted functions or on just your introverted functions. And if you're an introverted function lead, you need that extroverted auxiliary to help you actually interact with the world. And then I'm thinking about OPS too with the jumper styles. Is there any trend towards the jumpers being a little more unhealthy?
I mean, maybe Joyce can comment on this too. I wouldn't say that. I would say that like, at least like when you're looking at their documents, it's like, you have some of the jumpers who are like Tony Robbins, or Gary Vee, and they're very much what people would consider to be they have a lot of ownership in their particular area. You wouldn't look at them as particularly unhealthy people or unhealthy types. And then on the other side, the more introverted side, you have like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. And so it's like, well, it depends how you define unhealth, I guess, and like how people would perceive that. But I would say there's definitely, very like notable people who are respected, I guess, in either category. So, but I think you have healthy and unhealthy types, no matter what type you are.
Or maybe that was a bad choice of words on my part. Probably more maybe unbalanced would be a better word for me to use there.
I think the only thing I notice when it comes to sorry, Joyce. The only thing that I notice when it comes to the so-called like the jumper types or the types who tend to mesh more into that third function is that they struggle to communicate, especially if they're introverted types. Or if they're like extroverted types, then they struggle to like slow down and like really like stop to process anything. So there is a difference with those types if they're choosing to engage in that third function a little bit more, or if like they're like literally just kind of like, as we would call it, looping or like stuck in the first and third function, like they can't escape even if they wanted to. And I think that's where you're going to see the variance in how you might see health within those functions, or those people who might be closer to the OP jumpers.
I find with people who are introverts, they prefer that sometimes their top two they prefer their introverted functions sometimes, and extroverts sometimes prefer their extroverted functions. And it doesn't have to be looping. It can actually be very healthy too. So I think if someone is a jumper, you can totally be a healthy jumper too, which is one of the things I think OPS does right, because it takes away the negative connotation from using your third function too much. Because in some cases it's unhealthy, but in other cases it's totally healthy to use your third function. For introverts who lean on their two introverted functions more, they're going to be on the more introverted spectrum of the introvert type. So if an INFJ uses NITI more often, they're going to be extra introverted in whatever sense that would be. And if an extrovert leans on their two extroverted functions, they're going to be extra extroverted. And so they're going to be more moving in the outside world and in the external world more often. I find that it's not always looping, which is interesting. It can just be a natural mode of being too.
I always joke when I meet younger ENFJs, have you gone through your party phase yet? Because I find that a lot of the ENFJs have that like FE, SE, like party phase in there. You know, my wife included had her party phase when she was in her 20s, and now it's like NI is developing, and it's like she's mellowing, and you kind of see that return to form almost after the exploration period with the third function, which some people might explore and then decide that they fit more with that, so they stay there.
Right.
I think it's kind of piggybacking off what Joyce said. Like the looping isn't necessarily an unhealthy thing, but it can be. Kind of like I use my FI to kind of navigate, like, is this right or wrong? Do I feel good about this or do I feel bad about that? And sometimes it's healthy rather than steamrolling somebody over with my TE to kind of, put myself in their shoes and empathize, kind of get an idea and empathize with them of where they're coming from and where they're going, rather than, well, this is more efficient. I don't care about your emotions. Where my FE trickster definitely comes in. I just kind of will rationalize people's emotions and really won't take them into consideration and validate them. I'll just steamroll them basically, and I don't intentionally do that.
Yeah, and I'll actually need to go after this comment, but I wanted to say, I wonder to what extent, because as I've looked at, what has been described as looping before, I've wondered to what extent it's more of not the looping that is the problem, not the dominant tertiary sort of interaction that's the problem per se, but that there's some other problem, like they have undiagnosed OCD or an anxiety or something like this that is colored by their type, so that the things that they will latch onto and the way that their warped reasoning will work will be colored by it, and so it appears as though the main problem is the type, when really it's probably this other thing, and there could be a more normal, healthy way for that looping to occur, and then we wouldn't call it looping, we'd just call it being whatever that type is. But
Right.
so that's my 2 cents anyway.
Awesome.
But it's been a pleasure, everybody. This has been fun. Thank you.
Nice meeting
This has been informative. It's good meeting you guys too. I hope to talk with you again sometime.
Thank you so much. Everyone, buy his book. Buy it now.
Yay!
I actually
Give
am going to
me
have to head out
money.
here soon too. It's kind of late for me.
It's my book. There it
Me too.
is. Asura
thank
also
you
has to head out. We will walk into the sunset, the two of us.
Yes.
All right. Does anyone want to say anything before I end stream? I think it's probably a good point to end stream.